time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The Yoon Suk-yeol government's economic policy team will launch on Wednesday, officially, a day after the South Korean president's inauguration. And as they get to work, they're faced with very difficult tasks. They need to salvage an economy that is grappling with not only the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, trade disturbances, and soaring inflation, like most countries around the world, but also structural issues that have worsened income polarization, housing prices, and prospects for jobs, as well as future productivity. So how will they address these challenges, and what should be done to tackle these structural issues that have long plagued the Korean economy? For this, we connect with Kim Se-wan, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University, and Troy Stangerone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Very warm welcome to you both. Well, Professor Kim, my first question going to you. South Korea's new finance minister, Chu Kyung-ho, his first task is going to be a rather big one. It's going to be rolling out a supplementary budget, or introducing it at least, for a lot of small business owners in South Korea who have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. Now, what do you think this supplementary bill is going to look like, and to what extent do you think it's going to bring relief?
Even with 4% economic growth last year, Korean economy is not fully recovered from coronavirus pandemic yet. And the hardest hit by the pandemic is self-employers and small business owners, particularly in service sector. So far, government supports on self-employers and small business owners is about 35.1 trillion won from the beginning of, from the outbreak of pandemic. But it is far below their business losses of about 54 trillion won. So it is necessary to provide a certain form of economic relief to these people. President Yoon's government's plan to provide cash support through an extra budget of about 35 trillion won. The details about this plan and how to finance this project will be announced sometime late this week. During the election campaign, actually, President Yoon promised to spend around 50 trillion won to compensate the self-employed for their losses caused by tougher COVID-19 curbs.
So indeed, in order to address these concerns, the everyday lives of the South Korean people, Yoon's team has, during the transition period, constantly emphasized the need to improve people's livelihoods. But Mr. Stangerone, there are still some concerns that with Yoon's party being traditionally pro-business, they might overlook some social welfare elements. Do you think they will pay enough attention to improving people's livelihoods? And what are the key areas that you think they need to prioritize?
So when we look at the structural issues that the Yoon administration faces in South Korea, some of these are in the labor market, some of these are in the recovery from the pandemic, and some of these go back to issues related simply to the dual nature of South Korea's own labor market. But when we look at this, what we come to the conclusion for is that, as Dr. Kim said, SMEs have been hit the hardest, specifically single owners. And so the pledge to take and provide support to them is important. But the Yoon administration will need to look and ask, how do we take and help larger firms, larger SMEs take and become large firms? How do we grow these firms so that way they don't stagnate? And that's going to be one of the key things to taking and trying to take and resolve this issue. Two, how do we take and open up the labor market? South Korea traditionally has had a dual labor market, and that's made it challenging for young people who often face difficulties in getting good jobs to get good jobs. How do we make it more efficient in the labor market? We saw during the pandemic, there were challenges because of the dual labor market in terms of efficiently allocating workers out to different jobs and back into the economy. And so we need to see how do we deal with that. But at the same time, you also have issues of how do you create new jobs and new industries. And the Yoon administration has put forward proposals to take and loosen regulations. Some of those will be good, but we also need to remember that sometimes regulations actually spur innovation, that they don't always hinder innovation. And a good example of this is climate change and energy. If you loosen climate change goals, you're likely to see simply a return to fossil fuels. MIT is a new report out that suggests that Korea is actually one of the more innovative economies when it comes to green technology. this might actually stifle a potential growth area and one that would create jobs for people in South Korea. So how do you balance innovation and regulation together? And in terms of broader social welfare, Park and Hae took and increased the pensions for retirees. We saw an increase under Moon Jae-in. Korea still has some of the highest levels of old age poverty. So I think this is something that the Yoon administration will need to address, and there is a history within their own party of actually doing that as well.
And Professor Kim, well, there has been some criticism that the previous Moon administration didn't spend enough on small businesses and ordinary people at the right time during the pandemic with its supplementary budget plans. But right now, there are fears that South Korea's level of debt is getting unmanageable, with its debt to GDP ratio expected to reach a record high of 50.1% this year. And, well, some experts, though, they've voiced concern that the biggest supplementary budget ever to come, that's going to worsen the situation. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's the tough question, but President Yoon's government should be carefully set the policy priority between supporting people with government money and recovering fiscal health. Korean government is projected to see the fiscal deficit sharply increase this year and next year in the wake of several times of supplementary budget. This expanding government's expenditure makes national debts possibly break through 1,100 trillion won mark, or over 50% of GDP this year. It means that conditions are not suitable to issue new bonds to stimulate the Korean economy. But at the same time, it should be recognized that it is government expenditure that has a power to revive Korean economy as of now. Since recovering Korean economy, which has been highlighted by President Yoon, means higher income and more jobs, President Yoon's government would put higher priority on economic stimulus through government's spending than the physical health.
Professor Kim, another question to you. Now, another huge economic challenge that the new government faces is housing prices. And of course, the previous administration tried and failed over 24 times to cool the overheated market, but clearly failed, of course. But the question is it even possible at this point? And what do you think Yoon's economic team plans to do differently?
It looks that one of the toughest challenges of President Yoon's government would be stabilizing housing market. To new government, there are two pillars of housing market policy. One is providing more mortgages, loans to the real house buyers, like young and newly married people with favorable conditions at interest rate. Another is providing more apartment in major metro areas. But providing mortgages at lower interest rate can further raise the housing price. And constructing apartment is a massive size, takes a long time, over 3 to 5 years. It means then, against new government's intention, there are quite a few uncertainties in housing market. But if new government is successful in mixing these two policies without stimulating housing demand, the housing price increase would be limited.
And Mrs. Tangro, during the transition period, President Yoon's team, they announced a plan for a digital revolution by updating the country's platforms to spur data innovation among citizens, businesses, and also government bodies. And, well, past governments have actually announced very similar sounding data revolution plans. So do you think this one is going to be any different? I mean, what needs to be done to fundamentally resolve South Korea's lack of innovation ventures?
This is actually fairly ambitious in President Yoon wanted to take and actually put together essentially a one-stop shop for government data to where any citizen could access all of their information in one spot. It's going to require a lot of coordination across departments, across ministries, across different sectors, and also input from the private sector on how you do this, and questions on legality in terms of what actually is perhaps private data that couldn't be shared across ministries. So you're going to have these issues that are going to have to be worked through. But in terms of focusing on big data and artificial intelligence, which is a continuation of the prior Moon administration's focus, I think these are really critical for the country going forward. how you take and pull together data to take and have new innovations, be they either drug research. We saw during the pandemic, artificial intelligence helped South Korea to take and develop one of the first test kits for COVID-19. So it's important when you need speed to go through data. Artificial intelligence will help you analyze that data, and you need to have the stores of data to do that. And so this is going to be a challenge for the administration going forward, but it's going to be key for the economy in the future.
Right, a lot of regulatory challenges as well. And well, Professor Kim, now, President Yoon, when he took the oath of office yesterday, his speech mentioned the need for a rapid, sustainable growth for the Korean economy. And there seemed to be a sense of urgency in saying this, in safeguarding South Korea's economic security. How do you think the Yoon administration is going to go about in order to boost Korea's capacity to really ramp up its economic growth?
Well, the new government will employ all available policy tools in boosting up Korean economy in the short run. But here comes a complex economic situation even before initiating new policies. Korean economy is suffering already from super high inflation, lukewarm domestic consumption and investment, and global production chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine, and so on. So new government should be implementing their own policies while controlling these difficulties, mostly originated from foreign countries. It means that new government needs to be flexible enough to compromise all these difficulties while boosting up economic growth in the short run. So it's going to be a tough work.
And Mr. Stangreen, now South Korea's trade, with the country being a heavily trade-dependent nation, is going to have to do some careful balancing when it comes to its trade ties with China. It's still in a very sticky situation, as the Chinese market is very hard to replace given the sheer size of it. And to what extent do you think South Korea will be able to decouple from China, and what can Seoul do in order to bolster its economic security given the geopolitical circumstances?
I think this is a challenge the United States faces, every country in the world faces. How do you take and minimize your exposure to China while also taking and benefiting from the market? And this is where the economic security component comes in. What key industries do we need to take and ensure that we have alternative suppliers to where China is the primary supplier today? So if we look, for example, at EV batteries, an area where South Korea is a leader, where they're partnering with US automobile manufacturers to develop electronic vehicles, most of the rare earth minerals, things like lithium, cobalt, and other minerals that go into these batteries are either processed in China, about 70% or more of them are all processed in China, or the mines for them are actually controlled, in the case of, like, for example, cobalt, primarily by Chinese firms in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's going to be about how do we take and develop alternative structures to take and gain access to the minerals and the refining in other parts of the world or in South Korea itself. So that way, not that you pull completely out of the Chinese market, but that you minimize your exposure. So that way, if you have a future situation to where China decides to place and put informal sanctions on South Korea or someone else, there are alternative providers who can provide the materials that the firms will need. And so I think it's more about how do you take and create this, safety net, if you will, for supply chains, as opposed to taking and actually really decoupling from China itself.
And Mr. Stangreen, South Korea aims to join the Japan-led mega free trade deal, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's also widely expected to partake in the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as well, which is widely expected to launch this month. And how vital is it for South Korea to join these kind of initiatives? And do you see any possibility of progress on these fronts when President Yoon meets with President Biden and possibly the Japanese Prime Minister as well this month?
I think it's important for South Korea in both. When we talk about the CPTPP, the discussion is often about tariffs, and sometimes people will raise the issue of South Korea already having FTAs with many of these countries. Now, obviously, Japan is in RCEP now they have one with Japan as well, but had been the one large exception previously. But CPTPP is really about setting the rules. And what we know in terms of trade is that it's important to have good, strong rules. And so I think for South Korea, a country who's dependent on trade, it's important to be in agreements that reinforce global trading standards and rules. Now, when we look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, thought that still needs to be fleshed out by the Biden administration, but areas like supply chains will be important. And one of the things that I think will be key here is, as I mentioned, it's about taking and analyzing our supply chains, determining how we can create alternative supply chains to take and ensure that during future pandemics, during future wars, during future periods of economic coercion, there are alternative sources to take and provide the supplies and inputs that are needed for farms to be able to produce the goods that they're currently producing. And this is one of the things that I think is important for the United States as well to think about, is that we often focus in the United States on semiconductors. But semiconductors have vast supply chains. And so working through how we ensure that these supply chains are secure and that we have the economic security we need both in South Korea and the United States is going to be a critical part of this type of cooperation.
And just before we wrap up, Professor Kim, as South Koreans still grapple with the economic impact of the pandemic, as well as the long-standing issues that we had in the economy, which really cost dim prospects for the domestic situation, what do you hope to see from Yoon's economic policy team to genuinely improve the livelihoods of the South Korean people?
One of the 6 goals of new government is a global leading nation that contributes to freedom, peace, and prosperity. So for gaining and maintaining leadership in global economy, there should be structural reform in Korean industries, which is not easy. For example, with tasks such as securing an overwhelming lead in semiconductor, artificial intelligence, and battery, and other future strategic industries, conventional industries in manufacturing should be reconstructed by adopting these technologies. It also generates a certain level of social unrest in doing so. So it is required for new government to know how to mediate collisions of economic interest between different parts of the economy.
Well, I'm afraid that's where we must leave it today. Thank you very much, Professor Kim Seon at Ewha Women's University and Director Troy Stangorin at the Korea Economic Institute of America for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.